Okay. Tim Johnson, welcome to the program from an Airbnb in Vermont. It's good to see you, buddy.
You too. You too. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Explain to the audience what you just told me about your hand before we pressed record here.
Well, hopefully we'll get a little bit of a background noise to go along with it. But the Airbnb hosts were like, hey, while you're here, would you mind feeding the chickens and picking up the eggs in the morning? And I was like, yeah, of course. Why not? So I'm out there and I'm in the coop and I get close to a hen and I'm like trying to pick her up and put water and food in the thing. And the rooster comes ripping at me like full speed and he wants to attack me. And I like pull my hand away really quickly because he's trying to like just peck me so hard. And I smash the back of my hand against the side of the chicken coop. So here I am, very swollen, very sore, and I'm not even sure if I can hold a beer at this point. So
look at you playing injured. I appreciate the hustle. Still coming to do the podcast, even though a rooster managed to potentially break your hand. Dude, I'm so excited to have you on the show, and I think people are really going to love this. And obviously, most of the people who listen to the show are runners, but I love to talk about other sports. I'm a big fan of other sports, and I think you're going to have a lot of valuable things to leave the audience with, even if they don't necessarily share the same sort of like competitive background that you do. But before we get started, I wanted to first give you an opportunity to talk about Wout van Aert yesterday on the Ventoux. Of course, I'm talking about the Tour de France now, stage 11. Yeah. Wout van Aert, the reason I want to ask you about it is because he comes from the cross background, the cyclocross background. So what were your reactions seeing Wout smash that stage yesterday? And just give me your professional sort of take on his trajectory through cyclocross and into the Grand Tour.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he's one of us for sure. I mean, I remember seeing him up close for the first time at Cross Vegas. So that was, a September cross race around the Interbike Trade Show in Las Vegas. And little Wout at that point, was literally 5'7", 120 pounds. I mean, he was this skinny little kid. He was 18, maybe, racing under 23. And this little kid, I'm racing and I think I was like riding top 5 and it was him and Quentin Hermans, who's another well-known Belgian cross racer. These two little kids were on this under 23 program from FIDE at the time. And I couldn't get rid of them. I'm attacking them. I'm trying to outrun them. I'm trying to bunny hop. They're bunny hopping. And I remember getting to the finish line. And, this is a big deal in the US. Like Cross Vegas was a big race.
Yeah.
A C1 race. And big money on the line. Sven Nys is there. I think he might have won that night. Anyways, get to the finish and I'm sprinting against Quentin Hermans and Wout van Aert. And I get smoked by both of them. And I'm like, I don't know, 35 at this point, early 30s maybe.
Yeah.
And this kid just crushed me.
Yeah.
I was like, who the hell is this kid? And so going to Europe to continue to race and see him around, we became friends. I mean, Wout is a legitimate friend and someone who I keep in touch with. He went through some real tough challenges. So imagine being like the chosen one in your country. You are the next best hope after the reign of Sven Nys, who's like, superstar. Not only is that enough pressure, but then you have someone like Mathieu van der Poel, who's from the Netherlands, who's the same age, a year younger than you, who is better than you. So you've got the two countries that are competing against each other the most. You've got somebody who's a little bit better and you have to deal with that. He got into some team issues a bunch of years ago. And it was nice to be able to have a conversation with him while he's in the middle of this, his team is splitting. He's getting sued by a former sponsor, yet he's not being taken care of. It's like the background of sport, the business of sport there's always something more than what you read. And so here's a kid, he was like 22 at the time. He was already world champion, I think twice by then. And he eventually signed for the team he's currently racing for,
Jumbo Visma. Yep.
So he gets picked up by, this up and coming team that's going to just, give him the opportunities he needs, eventually putting someone like Roglic on the team. They become this like two-headed monster for the squad. And anyways, he made a lot of really mature decisions as a young rider, even while growing up under the spotlight in a country like Belgium. And then the Tour de France 2 years ago, he wins a stage early in the race, his first Tour de France. He wins the time trial a few days later. Yeah. So legitimate race against the clock. You are the only person that can win or lose. He wins. At the second time trial of the Tour, like 10 days later, he's in this TT. He's having a great race. He goes around a corner and he takes it so tight and so quickly that he clips the fence on the inside of the turn. And there's like this interlocking fencing that is around the course in a bike race, sometimes in running races. And he clips this fence so closely, a piece of metal about the length of your index finger goes into his glute and rips the muscle from the bone.
No.
He crashes so badly. This is a really strong, powerful guy. By this point, he's like 6'2", maybe 6'3". I mean, he's actually a lot like you in size. He's bigger than most in the sport, but he's so powerful.
This is why I love him. I love him because he comes from cross and now he's like smashing it as a Grand Tour rider. And
totally,
he's a bigger guy. He can win in the mountains and he can win on the time trials. He's such a beast.
To win a legitimate sprint stage and a TT. I mean, that hasn't been done in a long time.
Yeah.
And certainly not without drugs. And so he's like, anyways, he ends up on the ground. Incredible crash, ripping this powerful muscle off of his pelvis, off of his femur. He has, 9 or 10 months of rehab ahead of him. They reattach the muscles, really nasty crash. So to see him come back to continue to win, continue to deal with Mathieu van der Poel, and then to crush it yesterday on Fontu, it's just awesome. I mean, it gives you goosebumps thinking about it. Great guy.
That's so cool, man. Well, thanks for providing your perspective as a cyclocross icon who also raced a lot on the roads. But, Tim, I want to talk a lot about your career, not only as a professional athlete, but one of the things that I really respect and admire about you is the fact that you've been able to continue to have a really big impact on your sport and the athletes within it, both the professionals and sort of the more recreational participants in the sport of cycling as you've aged out of being sort of like a top tier professional racer. And so I want to talk about all those things, but I think first, just because of the fact that most of the people who listen to this aren't going to be as familiar with your career as I am, just give the quick, like 2-minute version of who Tim Johnson is, sort of how you came up within the sport, and then we'll go a little bit deeper on your career.
Sure. Well, thank you. That was very kind of you. Intros like that, I can't get my head around it. But I was I played soccer as a kid. I got into like BMX. I kind of ran a little bit, but I played soccer for a long time. Got into mountain biking as a local kid in New England, and my world was very small at that time. I was really only, knew my local towns, and that was it. But through bike racing, I got exposed to the New England area through mountain biking. I got into a little bit of road racing, and then I was introduced to the sport of cyclocross shortly after that. And so I had this kind of parallel path because cross was so small at the time. I was focusing on the road and mountain bike. Mountain bike kind of split away for a while and focused on the road. I turned professional in 2000. And by that point, I had just scored the first medal at Cyclocross World Championships for an American. So it was like a really big deal. And so I continued on the road. I was like, kind of this up and coming amateur rider, as like amateur of the year from Velo News, like, our Bible of the sport, cyclocross racer of the year. I won the elite nationals as a first year elite. So you kind of age out of under 23 and then you start racing with the big boys, and I was able to win it. So I eventually won 6 national championships. Kind of the thing I'm most proud of in cycling is that I went to the world championships for road, mountain bike, and cyclocross. And so that's like, I was always like I always considered myself to be a cyclist rather than one and not the others. And so that was always kind of like a thing in the back of my head. And, you mentioned kind of at the outset that, I came up in an era of doping, and I had my heart broken by the sport. I had my heart broken by my peers, my, direct kind of leaders of my sport. I had my heart broken as a fan, really just kind of gave me a lot of reasons to stop. And that was kind of what happened to my age group, to my generation. Each year, the amount of riders that I started with would get less and less, and the ones who are still racing. And so I'm a 1977 guy, like Jeff Kabush, 1977. Katarina Nash is 1977. So like Jeff and I have a lot in common because he stuck it out. He was right up against the best in the sport, just, almost openly doping in some cases. At that time. And he stuck it out, and he's got, one of the longest, best careers in the sport because his approach to it was similar to mine. Like, it was just about who he was and why he loved it rather than how fast he went or, I don't know.
If you're on top of the podium.
How willing are you to risk it?
Right. So I want to talk about that. So you said you came up sort of as a mountain biker and cross athlete before you kind of got called up to the big leagues. At least that's my interpretation of what that must feel like as a up and coming, rider with professional aspirations to kind of get called up to race in Europe. How did that opportunity come about? Did you feel like you had made it at the time? And then at what point did it become clear what the culture was like in road cycling at that time?
There was a bit of a gap because I turned professional in the US. I rode for a team called Saturn, which was like the best domestic team at the time. So we were very well funded, a couple $1 million budget. We had a men's and women's squad. So my first pro contract, I had a salary, like an actual salary. It was sizable. It was not like, Phil Gaiman's book is about like, getting paid $2,000 a year. Like, that was not my contract. I was kind of coming in at a much higher level because of my success in cyclocross, and kind of, I had already had a name that was built through that. We got free cars. I was living like the high life basically. And then it was a domestic and international circuit of races. We had races like the San Francisco Grand Prix, which is downtown San Francisco, shut the city down, a few 100,000 fans. It was, a huge thing, a tour of Georgia. At that time, there were quite a bit of races in the US that you could do. We would go to Europe to kind of get like bigger, harder races, and then come back and try and beat all the other Americans. So I did that for 3 years before I got called up, and I got called up to a new Spanish team that, looking back at it, was a terrible team, but I didn't know. I was like, oh my God, I'm going to race the tour next year. This is awesome. Like, I'm in. I got a 2-year deal. I was so excited for it. And I think my biggest mistake was getting there and immediately thinking that because I was now there, they knew better than me. Like, they knew better than I possibly could about how to go fast, which, in some ways was like 100% true.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I was like, yeah, of course I can ride 6 hours tomorrow, and then 6 hours the next day, and 6 hours the day after that. Of course I'll ride with Tyler Hamilton, Levi Leipheimer every day in Girona, because that's just what pros do. Never mind the fact that they had been pro for 5 years or 7 years longer than me. And, they were obviously dealing with a slightly different fuel source. And, so I was getting crushed. Like, I had my legs ripped off and my heart ripped out. And like, by the time, I got through that first year, I was just in pieces, and I quit the sport. I quit the second year of my contract.
But talk about the fuel source, because was it clear to you at that time that what was going on? Was it explicit?
No, the biggest scandal at that point was still 1998 with the Festina scandal. Through early 2000s, it was like a random person here and there would test positive. It wasn't like systematic doping across different teams or countries. And so it was kind of an open secret amongst some riders, and then others weren't clued in at all. Like, you had to be a part of this like separate, the chosen people to do this. And And so I rode with those guys as like friends. And like, I was the puppy dog following along on these training rides. I'd be like, you're doing intervals for 3 hours, like above Girona, like in the mountains with no food. Like, okay, cool. I'm in.
Yeah.
Like thinking back now with perspective and like understanding, it was absurd to even attempt it. Never mind do it. And so I got slower and slower. Like I just literally ripped my body to pieces. And so, classic overtraining symptoms of like, ferritin levels drop to the bottom. Cortisol is through the roof. Like my body stopped being efficient. I wasn't sleeping anymore. I was like panic eating. And I mean, some of the worst times of my life were in those moments between like having your hands almost able to touch the dream that you've been going for. And on the other hand, realizing that you're miles and miles and miles away.
So was there ever for you the temptation to sort of step across that very explicit line?
For sure.
And how do you resist temptation like that? If you do love the sport and you do want to be a professional, what was it like dealing with that temptation, and how'd you avoid it? How'd you resist it?
I think the best thing that happened to me it was a couple things. One was that I was a little bit older when I was finally brought over there, given the chance to get over there. I had already been racing. I had kind of like established a bit of who I was. I was in a relationship that was great. Like I knew that, this was like the version of my sport that I was like happy with. And then the other thing was that by the time I kind of saw what was really happening, I realized that the people that I was racing with as teammates and some peers in the other from the other teams were people that I had nothing to do with, like nothing in common with, but also I didn't want them anywhere near. Like they were kind of schmucks. Like, they treated people like shit. They treated the sport like shit because they were willing to like step all over it and just kind of like gamify it for their own purposes. And it was like,
wow, what a great way to describe that. Treating the sport like shit.
I wish I could have at the time, but it wasn't that easy. Like, I remember getting shit for reading books, like my mom's a librarian and I grew up reading, and like, there I was in hotel rooms, like completely shattered. And I'm like trying to get lost in whatever I'm reading, 'cause that's like the only salvation I have in the moment. Like, I mean, and I think one of the other things that saved me was that the people who were like giving me this like door to something different, they weren't my friends and they weren't my mentors. They were like, and reading back through like, Postal and knowing the guys who were involved and at some level and some better than others, like they were put in positions that I was not put into. And I don't know what it would have been like if I was, it wasn't like, hey dude, you and me, like, let's go do this. Like, this is what we need to do to get to the next race or like to get better. I never had that moment. And so I think I was pretty lucky for that. So
eventually you end up leaving Europe and sort of like quitting the road cycling scene and coming home. How did that, as you were returning home, I mean, you said that the sport had sort of like broken your heart, but how did that whole experience sort of like change your feeling about the sport, your enjoyment of the sport that you've been doing since you were a little kid?
Yeah, I had to restart like everything, the things that made me, that challenged me. I needed to like really take down the size of those, like distance, speed, who I was racing against. Am I thinking about racing the Tour? Am I thinking about like suffering through local Southeast races in Georgia on this like really small pro team to get ready for Tour of Georgia as like the highlight of the season?
Yeah.
I had to like really reset. I took a few months off. I didn't touch the bike at all, which is a big no-no for someone who's trying to be a professional cyclist.
Yeah.
And all the while, like I had cyclocross in the back of my mind, but I had given it up to focus on road. And I didn't go to the World Championships. I didn't go to nationals even. I really stopped. And so by the time I got my feet under me again, I was like, back to riding bikes, and I could also do cyclocross again. And by that point, I had kind of like figured out that if I did it right, I could have a road team, get paid to race on the road, and then also start a cyclocross team, and then get different sponsors, different support. And I could make two incomes. Basically, I could be a professional in two sports. And so that's how I did it the first couple of years. And I did almost a full road season, almost a full cyclocross season. The sport was growing in the US. We had more and more races. We had more and more prize money. We were getting on TV. Like, it was awesome, so I kind of like hit that at the right time. And there were some real decisions that we made to take advantage of that. Like Jeremy Powers was a peer at the time. He was on my team as like my little brother. And as we were growing together in the sport, we were like, yeah, let's focus on the US. Like, we can make a real difference here. If you and I can go to these races and you and I can help promote them, then we can make the exposure bigger and better. We can sell this to our sponsors better. He splits off and goes to a new team. We become like nemesis, and like, it was really cool how it all developed, but it was really organic.
Yeah.
And it was organic because we put ourselves in the position to take advantage of it instead of like pursuing this dead end dream, which, this was 2007, 8, 9, like.
What a fortuitous thing. I mean, as you said, obviously like cyclocross is taken off like a rocket ship since that time, and has only become more popular in recent years. And so to stick with your values and your morals and leaving that European scene in the heyday of when clearly there was a lot of shady stuff going on, only to come back and refine your passion in cyclocross and then build an amazing career out of it. What was it like when it started to become very clear and explicit as you're sort of building your cross career that the road cycling scene was sort of like crumbling at that point? Yeah. And maybe talk a little bit about, is there a difference in culture between kind of the European road racing scene and mountain bike and cross scene? And I guess, was that stuff happening? Was there an absence of doping in cyclocross? I mean, were you confident in the integrity of the competition?
Yeah. Up and down. I mean, that might be a whole nother podcast.
Sure.
But yeah, the way that cross was growing versus road was kind of decreasing in overall size. At the start of Tour California, we were, capital city to major city, San Francisco, Sacramento, like all the way down the coast, LA, like huge race. And it was 10 days at some points, at every big pro team. Over the years, it got harder and harder for the Tour of California to maintain that level of competition. But I did the first 4, I think, and loved it. It was an amazing race. And I was on the best team in the US, like we were winning everything. And so it was really great. And then I would just like hang up my road bike at the last road race. I would get on my cross bike and I wouldn't touch my road bike again until February. Like, that's just how it worked. Mm-hmm. So I was really lucky to be able to do that. And I think it continued to give me perspective about where road was headed. The races got smaller. We would have one race with huge prize money, and then the next day we'd be somewhere else that was like such a tiny little shitty criterium in the middle of nowhere. It'd be like, wow, really? Like, this is what we're doing? Versus huge news. The USA is going to host the World Championships of Cyclocross for the first time in Louisville, Kentucky. It was like the biggest news we could have ever asked for. It's like, getting a tour stage in your town or like your country, or like the Super Bowl being hosted in your local area, and you're like a young football player and you want to get there someday.
Yeah.
So that was really, to see it like that. I think, I don't know that it's been like, I don't know that many other people share that same experience. So that was cool. The way cyclocross was kind of positioned, and I guess mountain biking and cyclocross kind of were really together in the early days of mountain biking. That was Thomas Frischnecht was a cyclocross world champion who became a mountain bike world champion, who now runs Kate Courtney's team. Mm-hmm. Scott Stram, at the World Cup level, Nino Schurter, like his history is cyclocross first, then mountain bike with a little bit of road. And then like as mountain biking kind of grew and changed direction, it really split off. And cyclocross wasn't a big sport. It wasn't a growing sport in Europe for many of the years that we were racing both in the US and in Europe. It really wasn't. And that kind of showed why they came to the US. They saw that as a growth potential, a growth market. They're like, oh, maybe we can do this. And Cross Vegas started, we had our first World Cup in the US. So it's like, we kind of gave cyclocross a big boost in the US internationally, and they've taken it and run with it. And it's continued to build. We have 3 World Cups in the US this fall. Big deal for us. But as far as like the links that people would go to, I think there was a big shift. Like the early days of cyclocross, there were some big names that I think were probably involved in some shady stuff.
Yeah.
But no one was ever really scandalous. Like, I don't know that we had much as far as like people getting busted. And I think there was also an expectation that like, the EPO era, the benefits were on 30-minute alpine climbs over a 10-day, 2-week, 3-week stage race. So cyclocross wasn't really quite the ripe market for that.
Yeah. Well, thank goodness.
Well, yeah, like it just didn't have the money.
Yeah.
You could sign a $2 million a year contract on the road.
So I want to talk about this too, because I think the economics of it is interesting. And one of the things you said earlier was something to the effect of the behind the scenes business is always a little bit more involved than we expect. And for you to leave what was probably a really comfortable salary as a professional road cyclist in Europe to come back to sort of ingratiate yourself in this smaller community of cyclocross and really help build it. I guess like what I'm curious about is like, was that a huge sacrifice for you? And maybe also tying in contemporary professional cycling, like there's a lot, at least as an outside observer, it seems like there's a lot more opportunity for professionals to make it across in many different applications, right? You don't necessarily have to go to Europe to race. You can be a pro cyclocross rider. You can be a mountain biker, more of a lifestyle cyclist like Phil Guyman. Anything there that you want to expand on just in terms of like the business of the sport, the economics of the sport?
I think that was always something I was really curious about or interested in. And I probably would credit that to being able to talk to people who were active and successful in business early in my career. Like I remember getting my first contract offer and giving it to my friend, dude, what do you think? And he had started and sold a company in the cycling industry, was like really actively kind of aware of like the economics of the sport. And he's like, no, he's like, ask for more. And I was like, really? Oh my God, are you serious? Like, do you think that this is crazy. Why would I ever do that? You mean they'll pay for my expenses and give me a check? Like, yeah, holy shit. So you kind of like get beyond some of that initial, levels that you might have as a beginner, or you just don't know anything. So I was lucky to have some people around me like that. The business of cycling, I think, is kind of a business model that is quickly changing and leaving. It's getting passed over by the understanding that you can not only own, but also create your own media. And so being one rider on a team of 15 where every single sponsorship category is full and sold on your behalf, you have no control whatsoever. Yeah. And so cyclocross was like a different season, and the road teams didn't want us to do it. They were like, no, don't do that. Just go home. Just like sit on your couch. Yeah. September, October, November, December, like start riding again and don't do anything. And I'm like, what? I mean, if I go to this race and I win, I get $500. Yeah. But if I go to that race and I win, I get $2,000. And then if I get in a magazine, I can sell that exposure, different an endorsement of a product to a company, and then I can make $5,000. Like, it was obvious that like the harder, the more creative I became, the better off I would be. So the single paycheck idea is like understanding that if you're already an independent contractor, you're not an employee of a cycling team, you have so little control. It's almost like a gig economy idea where, yes, the app tells you where to go pick someone up, but no, you're not an employee, so you don't deserve health insurance. You have to pay taxes out of your income, like things like that.
Yeah.
You have to own your own car, all this other stuff. So for cycling, it's like, yeah, you get a paycheck from a team, but really you don't get shit.
Yeah.
So cyclocross kind of gave me that chance to work on that. I remember I had a deal to ride Cannondale bikes. And so Cannondale had sponsored my road team that summer, but in cyclocross, it was a totally separate deal. And so I did an entire season on a new bike, a new model of a bike. And I was very successful. I got in a bunch of magazines and TV and the early web and all this stuff. And so the next year I got a signature model of the same bike. So I got royalties from sales. I remember getting to a big road race in Philadelphia. It was the national championships at the time. It was 250K in first week of June, went up and down Manayunk Wall and finished on right in front of the Rocky Steps in Philly.
Yes.
And Cannondale was there, and the marketing director at the time, he's like, "Hey, let's get a coffee." I'm like, "Yeah, sure." We sit down for coffee, and he's like, "Dude, I'm so excited. Like, the new bike coming, the signature, like I had signed this fax and then sent it in. That was the signature that was put onto the frame under the clear coat." I'm like, "Oh my God." Like, I grew up with BMX, and the signature model of anything was like a total dream. And so here's this like Cannondale XTJ was the model. And I was like, "Oh my God, like, so I'm in heaven." And he gave me a check for $20,000 to say thank you for doing such a great job.
Wow.
And I was like,
it's life-changing at that point.
Like, I thought the cyclocross thing was like for $5,000. And I thought it was like in addition to all the other shit I was doing. So then I'm like, maybe if I sell my shoes and my helmet, and my glasses and my clothing and the wheels and the components and like, but then you have to figure out what you're offering as value to all those companies. And then before you know it, I'm sure you can like understand, is like every relationship that you have takes time and it takes energy and it takes emails. So each one of those sponsors is like 1,000 emails and time. And so I wasn't playing, Xbox after my races. Yeah. I was like calling and I was writing and I was trying to say thank you enough. Like, I hope anyone listening out there.
So you're hustling much more than somebody who is on one of these grand tour teams racing throughout the year in Europe, where all those sponsorships are sold, as you said, on their behalf, and they don't have any say in who their partners are. And they likely only get a small fraction of whatever the deal is with the team. That's really interesting. So as you've you pioneered this sort of small business as a professional athlete. And now sort of as you've been able to mentor younger athletes coming up behind you, is there any sort of advice that you've given them in terms of, because obviously like you still have a relationship with Cannondale. I don't know how long you guys have been together. Yeah. You're one of the early North American Red Bull athletes. Mm-hmm. And, you've had done such a great job of delivering value to these brands and cultivating really long-term relationships with them. Mm-hmm. Anything there that you think would be valuable to the listeners, just in terms of like how to make it, because the number one thing that I really want to talk to you about is that, like, how do you make it? How do you continue to have an impact on the sport? How do you think creatively in a way that can allow you to approach it professionally?
Well, I definitely didn't do any of that alone. And I would still look at the things that I didn't do as like missed opportunities or disappointments in myself for not hustling even harder. I had my mechanic throughout my career and business partner, Stu Thorne, runs Cyclocross World, which is, at the time an online retailer for cyclocross products. But, he and I were we were a team, and if it was me sleeping on his floor of his hotel room when I was 17, up to, being at the World Championships for the 10th time with a chance of, going top 10 and like being at the head of the sport, we were always doing it together, and we would hire riders to join the team. We would help kind of figure out how to do it financially. I brought Cannondale in, and that's still a sponsor of the team to this day. Making it is really tough because yes, you have to be willing to hustle. So much of it is due to relationships. And so there's the physical capacity and ability, which is like on this side of things that cannot be overlooked. This is like key. It's kind of blurring with like the influencer world. Like, yep. Are they actually
happening across? Yeah, that happens in our sport too, in every sport at this point. I mean, the social exposure is as important as the performance at this point, it seems like.
Yeah. And like, that was kind of hard because I got shit for being on Twitter. I got shit for like, being on Instagram and like, not sitting there with my legs up after a training ride and being on my computer working. Like, so it's kind of funny how that works. Like, so you have to have that, you have to have the hustle to kind of pull things together. And then there's like the intangible part of it, which is like, what are you representing? Are you representing either something fresh? Are you representing some kind of authentic authority, like expert in your field? Are you translating for others? Like, can you have a conversation with someone who's not in your world so that they're interested in it and they want to follow along? Because a lot of people can't, like, they're so head down in like their little world that they can't have a conversation with someone who's not directly next to them in their sport. And then you also have to be open. Like, you have to be flexible. You can't be this rigid, like, I'm training this way, no matter what. Like, I look at running from the outside, having done some, my wife had been a runner for a long time. Like, it's like, yes, if you have the ability to run, you want to keep running, and maybe that will, you'll be faster for doing so, but then you just get hurt. But people still keep running. Like, it's like the durability of yourself in the sport. Like, you can't do it so much that you hate it. You can't do it so much that you get hurt. Yeah. You got to like love it to want to continue to do it. But like, I don't know, you got to do it right too.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, like, so kind of in the same vein, obviously, is like with injury and dealing with just like the stuff that we can't control in our lives and in sport. One of those things is aging. And I think one of the things that everybody in cycling really admires about you, and as somebody who's just like a casual fan of all sports, one of the things that I really appreciate about athletes is, how they age and how they continue to have an impact on their sport beyond the time at which they are in their prime and they're competing for podium positions and wins at every race. And you've done such a good job. I know you told me like you never made like an official announcement, hey, I'm retired from pro racing now, but instead it was just sort of like a gradual evolution of your impact. And I wondered if there was anything that you wanted to share that you think you did particularly well that's allowed you to continue to have an impact on the sport beyond just winning races. Because I mean, we're not even going to have time to really talk about all the great things that you've done. But obviously, like, you've had an amazing career. People can look at your Wikipedia or whatever if they want the full rundown. But, for me, and especially as somebody I'm 35, mid 30s, and still feel very much like I want to compete and whatever, but really I'm starting to feel more motivation to have a different impact on my sport as well. So just curious if you have any thoughts on that subject.
Yeah. One of the calculations that becomes more important as you get older is you've been developing these relationships, these sponsorships, these events that the organizers of, like, the people who kind of help to run your sport is like, turns out it takes a lot of time to ride, it takes a lot of time to run. You're always traveling. So you kind of like miss out on opportunities. And so when I stopped racing on the road, I I remember saying no to a contract offer that was legitimate. Like, please come back and be the captain of our road team. And I was like, nah, I don't know. I don't think I'm going to do it.
Yeah.
And then they're like, what? And it was because I had figured out that if I don't fill up my spring and summer with road racing, I'll have more time to service the upcoming cyclocross season with photo shoots and video shoots and training camps and like product launches and, you know, all the behind the scenes functions of sports endorsements. And I'll be able to go to a Tour California. I remember Rafa was an up and coming brand in the US, and, you know, the guys in Portland, I had met through cyclocross racing in New England, and they're like, hey, you know, we're going to do this. We're going to ride every mile of the Tour of California in like April before the race in May. Do you want to come with us? And I was like, yeah, sure. And they had this program called the Rafa Continental, but instead of staying in nice hotels, eating nice food, you know, like we all slept, we piled into these rooms, although they'll give me shit now because I never shared my bed with anyone. But we ended up riding this whole entire route, but they paid for a film crew and they put it out as a series of videos called Rafa Tour California 2011, I think. And it was epic. Like, it was so fucking fun. It was like 9 days, I think, that we were out there riding. And these were like cinematic quality, like tracking shots. And there were no drones, I think, at that time. But like Big Sur had just washed out. Highway 1's closed for like 100 miles. There were no cars. And it was just us riding along, and our camera guy, Dan Sharp, he had his DSLR with him. And this is like the first time I'd ever seen anyone riding with a big camera, and film these really cool shots, like whales in the distance and like just amazing stuff. I never would have been able to do that if I was still racing. Yeah. But that played during Tour California during the broadcast. So like I was now elevated among all of the people at the race because of this media exposure.
You didn't even have to race it.
I didn't even have to race it. I mean, I wasn't going to beat Tom Boonen, but like,
sure.
You know, it was one of those things where like, if you create space and you allow for like these relationships and these opportunities to kind of develop, then it just might pay off. And that, I think, has been a lot of luck, but it's also been a lot of like being open to new opportunities.
Sweet. So in the remaining time that we have, I wish we had a little bit more, but we'll have to do a round two. I think obviously I want to talk about USA Cycling and then ultimately talk about Supersapiens where you are now. And I guess just to start, what was how did you end up getting connected with USA Cycling, and in what capacity did they want to use your relationships and talents and reputation, and what value did you see as being part of that organization?
Well, I think that was one way for me that was important, is like, yes, I had stopped racing already. I still had relationships with Cannondale and Red Bull and Mavic and Giro and like Lululemon and some of these other companies. And working with USA Cycling, it was a fundraising role. So I was trying to help fund the programs that I took part in as a racer. And so it was a real give back opportunity, and it involved, you know, relationships and, you know, recognizing the fact that like there are a lot of people who love to ride, who have been successful in their lives and they're generous. And just to say, hey, you know, would you consider supporting our programs? Like, support these athletes. Like, you know, we've got Tokyo on the horizon. You've got LA 2028 coming up after Paris. Like, if you can help out now, you know, the benefits will be this, and this for all these different riders. And it's really cool to be a part of that. So I enjoyed it. I worked there with everyone there for 3 years. And, you know, having someone like Rob DiMartini come in, who I had known a little bit while he was at New Balance as CEO there. I got a chance to be exposed to a different side of the sport and different people involved. And it continued to evolve my understanding of what roles you might play in sport. You know, recently, well, I guess last year, a friend of mine, Phil Sutherland, who is a type 1 diabetic, who I had met years ago, actually the year I kind of pulled myself out of the hole of cycling, in Georgia. He was the first type 1 diabetic I had ever spent any time with. And he was a rider, and he was like a total go-getter and wanted to be the fastest guy at the races and, win collegiate nationals. And he wanted to turn pro. And I was like kind of an established pro at that point. And so we became friends and training partners. He did his first tour of California, and I helped him kind of get ready for it. And he calls me up and he's like, "Hey man," he's like, turns out that, being a type 1 is really hard for endurance sport in general. He was one of the only for a long time. Now his entire team is all diabetic. But he's like, the biggest difference that we ever did for any of our team members was give them visibility of their glucose. And so they hacked into a Wahoo. They took a sensor from Abbott and figured out a way to make the sensor talk to the Wahoo and put it in front of the riders. And it stopped them from bonking. It allowed them to fuel themselves better because they saw where they were going, like up and down, depending on what they ate, how long they were racing for, how hard the racing was. And he's like, "We're going to start a company and we're going to call it Supersapiens. Like, do you want in?" I was like, "Yes, of course I want in. Oh my God. I believe in you. I believe in the technology," because I had worn one at a couple Red Bull Project Endurance camps,
right? Yeah.
Where we wore CGMs, these continuous glucose monitors, for 10 days at a time. And at that point, it was just another layer, another metric that was added to 50 other layers of metrics. And it wasn't real time, but I understood the concept. And like, basically what happens is, as you're working out, you're running, you're riding, whatever, you're using glycogen, it turns into glucose, and it's in your bloodstream, and it powers your muscles. And if you keep eating and you maintain a high level of glucose and you don't let it drop, you can literally ride farther, run farther, and
perform
faster,
better.
and feel better. And if you can see that in real time, it's crazy, because you want to start eating far earlier. You want to eat more often, not necessarily more, but like it totally changes your perspective about what actually makes you do the thing that you're doing, riding, running, triathlon, whatever.
So as a former professional athlete, what is it like now, sort of like moving into the private sector, and maybe what experience or what skills that you developed as a pro athlete are you using now as a desk jockey?
Everything that I possibly can. It's startup life, like, everything from fundraising rounds, who's investing and why, to product, like how is the app working with the person behind it? Like, what are they seeing? What are the numbers doing? What do they show? What's the UX like of that person? To marketing opportunities, like, we're in the Giro on the banners on the side of the road. We're the title sponsor of Ironman Hawaii and a bunch of European Ironmans. Those are huge properties that we are now a part of. I actually leave for the Tour de France on Saturday, and we'll be there for the final week. Side note, the UCI, as our governing body of the sport, has decided to ban Supersapiens from use in competition. Crazy.
Just because it would potentially give some athletes an advantage, even though it's ideally keeping them healthier throughout the 3 weeks.
Lots of head shaking, understanding that
new technology, man, they'll come around.
It's crazy. Yeah. So like, we also sponsor UTMB. So, for the summer, I won't be there. But we'll
you got to come, bro. You got to come. It'll blow your mind, man. It's the Tour de France of trail running. It's
right. Exactly.
It's
I want to race it someday. I'd love to.
Dude, you got to.
Or I'll be there for your training runs, but maybe if I don't race. But no, so my role is very horizontal. Like I kind of touch a lot of different things, and I really do draw every bit of experience I've ever had within my sport. Also energy levels, like you got to be ready to go when you got to go. You can't just like put it off. Yeah. And it's also relationships. We're a fast growing company, and we're trying to hire the right people. And like, get the most out of them. And you gotta always be aware of like what people's motivations are and what can possibly allow them to be better at their jobs. So yeah, man, I'm pumped. I wake up in the morning and I want to look at my email. Like I'm really excited about what we're doing and where we're going.
That's awesome, man. Well, I know we've got to run here in a few minutes, but again, I just want to say it's really cool. I mean, it's just awesome that you had such a great career as a cyclist, and now you can use those relationships, which were always so important to you and that were critical in your success in building yourself as a small business and bringing the sport of cyclocross into the next generation. And now, obviously you still ride a lot. You're still very connected to the sport. And you guys put together a really cool video on the Trans Taiga video, which I'll put in the show notes. We don't have a ton of time to talk about that, but maybe talk a little bit about what you've got going on. Like if there's anything that's motivating you as a cyclist now, if you have any goals, or if there's any other just comments on the current landscape in cycling, the advent of gravel racing and sort of the rebirth the industry has had during COVID.
Oh my God. I mean, talk about a bike boom, but I think a couple things really excite me is that we've got a lot more gender equality, like women's racing. When I started, there was like one bright and shining star with our counterpart at Saturn. We had a full women's team they were all paid well. They all had just exactly the same support that we had, the same amount of money that we had. And after that team really went away, there wasn't a lot of support like that. Turns out that in the late 90s, early 2000s, you could win $50,000 for winning the HP Women's Challenge. Like, look it up online, but it was a 12-day stage race for women that was not UCI because the races were too long, the stages were too long, and the prize money was like 5 times that of a typical men's race. It was awesome. And it was definitely an American approach to women's cycling. So that's really cool. Gravel, I think, is a great way to show that because of everyone being out there at the same time. It's much more like at the level of everyone. People see it, but yet they still recognize what it takes to go faster, to be at the front of the races. And prize money is equal, just like in cyclocross as well. I think we are in a real golden age with the generalization or the non-specialization of professional cyclists, with Van der Poel and Marianne Vos and Pauline Ferrand-Prévot and Wout, like Tom Pidcock. You're getting these crossovers across 3 different disciplines on the every single weekend, basically. Mm-hmm. And that wasn't like that before. I love to see that. So I guess like things really are in a good spot, and hopefully they're getting better. And like whatever role I might have played in kind of like helping that come to fruition, I'm more than excited for. But yeah, man, it's been cool. So I'm excited for what's next.
Sweet. Well, Tim, thanks so much for coming on. Wish we had a little bit more time, but I'll let you go, and appreciate, just the example that you said. I appreciate you hooking me up with some Supersapiens stuff, and
of course,
try and keep that glycogen high. And let's do this again in the future. Super fun to chat.
Cool. Yeah. No, let's do it. I appreciate it.
All right, buddy.
See ya.